I thought that today I would do a case study on one of my favorite musicians throughout all time, which is Jimi Hendrix, a man who left behind a legacy far after his death. And we'll take a look over this series, because we'll likely do this in a few different parts, at why he was so strong at leaving behind a legacy. But I thought we'd take a look in particular today at the man himself, and likely what was driving him, what was the driving force behind his reason for exploring his music, and potentially some of the feelings which he may have been going through in association with that. When we want to take a look at a particular person's purpose, who they are, ideally what their career path is. And I like using the word vocation over career, because vocation is generally what we're put here for. Career sometimes ends up being something that we have to do to make money along the way, which isn't always in alignment with what our vocation is. So let's use the word vocation. Jimi says about people, and I'm looking at this through a Jimi astrology perspective. Jimi said about people who have the moon as their atmakaraka, such as Jimi Hendrix did, that quite often they are meant to be musicians. And we can see that ultimately this was the case in Jimi Hendrix's situation. And Hendrix's moon was in a particular section of the sky that's called Pusha nakshatra. And a couple of things that are said about Pusha nakshatra, which we may find interesting in terms of Hendrix's case. People who have their atmakaraka in Pusha are known to make loud announcements. And obviously we know that Hendrix played with a lot of loud volume. But the second thing that's associated with Pusha nakshatra, I want to draw relevance to a particular picture of Hendrix, which shows him with his guitar. And I believe it's at the Monterey Pop Festival where he set his guitar on fire, right? And so sure, one could have looked at that as all flash and trying to get attention and being as flashy as possible. But I think there was something else that was going on behind that for Jimi Hendrix, because one of the things that's connected with Pusha nakshatra is those who are engaged in sacrifices. And as we look at Hendrix's chart, we can see that this is something that's very meaningful. Because when we're looking at the atmakaraka and we look at it from the perspective of the navamsha, it becomes something that's called the swamsha, which is an indicator of the person's purpose, who they are, what they're here to do even more deeply, okay? And we can see by looking at this that his, I'm sorry, I just lost my magnifying glass. Let's bring that up again. That Hendrix's moon, which is his atmakaraka, was also in Pisces in his Navamsha chart. Pisces marks the end of the zodiac. It's the concept of liberation, the end of a cycle. When people have their atmakaraka in Pisces, quite often it can mean that they're here to complete something, to complete a cycle of their evolution very powerfully. But also it's Brahman Rashi. And with Brahman Rashis, that obviously has a connection to priests as well. So the concept of sacrifice becomes heightened by this particular position. But there are a lot of interesting, what are called Rashi aspects going on to Hendrix's atmakaraka, from Venus and Ketu over here in Gemini, down here to Saturn, Rahu, and Mars in Sagittarius. Let's take a look at Venus and Ketu in Gemini, first of all. Ketu is going to show us the security paradigm. And in the next video, we're going to take a deeper look at Hendrix's Ketu-Rahu nodal axis, but we're just going to touch on it briefly. Ketu gives us a strong foundation. And Ketu represents that with which we're the most secure, what we're more comfortable with. In Hendrix's particular chart, when we look at his main chart, the Rashi chart, Hendrix has his Ketu in Aquarius. Well, we can see that Hendrix was likely more comfortable being associated with peers, groups of peers, and more comfortable within himself within a group of peers. And it's quite known about Hendrix that he took the greatest pleasure in just bringing a lot of musicians back to his studio late at night in order to have little jam sessions. That's what made him the happiest, so to speak. Okay, so we've got Ketu and we've got Venus here, and both of them are aspecting the moon. So looking at Venus in this particular case, he found his interactions with those other musicians to be very healing, and it was something that brought him fulfillment. And this was something that he always fell back on when things were difficult for him. And we can find that when things were becoming the most intense for Hendrix, especially between 1968 and 1970, he quite often fell back on this particular concept, right? So that's how he found fulfillment, was through interaction with other musicians. But interestingly enough, if we look at his Rahu, and we'll explore this more in the next video, his Rahu's in Leo. So that's about becoming more individualized in his soul, becoming more comfortable within himself. And that's something that he was needing to explore in this particular lifetime. And we can see we've got Saturn, Rahu, and Mars, all three down here in Sagittarius. Well, on one level, he was peerless. He didn't have anybody else who could match his skills, but yet he wanted to be connected with all those other people, right? So it was somewhat of a lonely position for Hendrix. And we can see that basically Ketu and Rahu are both aspecting his moon, which likely made him feel a little bit alone and isolated. And there's a special interaction that's going on here between Saturn and Hendrix's moon, because Pusha nakshatra is ruled over by Saturn. And Saturn is in Rohini, which is ruled over by the moon. Okay, both of these are very important in terms of understanding Hendrix. His life and his work was quite a living sacrifice. Okay, he likely did it because he felt resigned to the fact that this was something that he had to do. But he had a message to share, right? But by the same token, it wasn't something that necessarily brought him a high level of happiness. He was feeling quite unfulfilled most of the time that he was doing it. It's one of the things that's known about his career was it reached a point where he wasn't concerned about the money that he was making from the albums. He was more concerned about the message, about putting a spiritual message out there and getting it out there. And this is something that really shows in Hendrix's chart in association with all of these planets. Okay, so we've got Saturn, Rahu, and Mars over here in Sagittarius. Looking at the explorative side of Sagittarius and the philosophical side of Sagittarius. So Rahu would have led him in this direction in terms of getting more of a spiritually related message out there. Okay, but he wasn't happy while this was going on. Basically, Ketu, which rules over Magha nakshatra, which is where Rahu is, and we've also got Ketu over here in Shatabisha, which is ruled by Rahu. These two planets are very deeply, even more so than usual, connected to each other. Okay, and with Magha, there's a certain side of putting the concerns of one's body, one's life to one side, and just getting on with what needs to be done in a particular set of circumstances. And in Hendrix's Navamsha, basically because of the strength of Mercury in Hendrix's Navamsha chart, Mercury being the ruling planet of Ketu, well, Ketu is not very happy. And so then that makes the concept of what Rahu is going through even more difficult. It creates a lot of tension with that. So he reached a point where he was just having a hard time even being here on the planet, doing what he was here to do, even though he could put his concerns and his needs aside in order to do what he needed to do. So that's going to do it for this first little look at Hendrix's astrology. Next look, we'll take a deeper look at understanding his nodal axis, some of the things that were going on in his life, and understanding the motive behind the music a little more deeply. But if you are interested in having a look at your own chart from this particular perspective, looking at your basically your Swamsha, understanding your career, or if you have anything in general you'd like a little more information on, I do offer several different types of astrological service, and you can find those through my astrological services page, which is linked in the left-hand corner below. That's going to do it for this assessment. And take very good care of yourself. Bye now.